There we go. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this year's Sotl conference. My name's Arnold Peers. I'm the head of the Department of Learning and Engineering Sciences here at KTH, so I sit just out on the side of the entry to the library, in fact, is where I have my office. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to have the honour of opening an event which I think is extremely significant to our community. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just to talk about why it is that I think it's important that we are all gathered here today and where I think we've been coming from and a little bit perhaps where I think we're going. And then I'm going to hand over to Ariane, who's our keynote speaker for this year, who's going to take us into the world of the unknown somewhat and talk about contextualized education with a focus on sustainability, which is one of those really important future questions. So what are we talking about here? Let's see if I can get my technology to work. Of course not. So let's try that again. Let's go over here. So let's talk about education a little bit. What's the vision for higher education? Depends who you are, really, but for me, it all begins with the learner. And I think that that's why we're gathered here. The learner is the most important thing in our environment. We want to support them, we want to help them to gain those skills that they need to equip themselves for a successful life in their career, and we want them also to be productive and useful members of our society. And that's part of where education comes in. The other thing that we are dealing with a lot more now than we used to is technologies. Those technologies are affecting the way in which we work, the way in which our society is shaped, the way in which education is delivered, and indeed is affecting our environment, thus leading us to focus on things like sustainability. How are we using these technologies in a constructive and in a socially responsible manner? The other thing where I work a lot is pedagogy. How do we integrate these things? The need of the learner, the demands of the technologies, the opportunities that technology give us, and combine those with an understanding of how people learn and how we can facilitate learning, enthusiasm, engagement, and a desire to make the world a better place. And if we get... There you go. I have my own personal assistant. If we look at the intersection of that space, that's where I think the education of the future is. We need to be taking all of those three factors into account, trying to work out how do they synthesize into something that really gives every person who enters our environment the best possible opportunity to make the most of their lives. And we talk a lot about where we're going with this, and we can do all sorts of great things. We can reach out beyond where we are today. We can reach out to the whole world through technology. You don't need to have the National Encyclopedia in your living room to look up facts nowadays. You can use your phone. You can ask Dr. Google all sorts of things that you would never have thought of even looking up in the National Encyclopedia previously. We can reach out to other cultures. We can try to reach the large mass of people who perhaps don't have what it takes to get here to us on campus. How do you help those people who don't have the good fortune to find themselves in Stockholm, in Sweden, close to KTH or to some other large seat of learning? And then, of course, the technology that can bring us this education in virtual environments. You might not even need to come to campus. You can experience many things in virtual environments. This type of technology we didn't even dream of 20 years ago when I started my teaching career. And now it's nearly a reality. We can build blended learning environments. We can build enhanced reality environments. We can build full virtual reality environments where people can experience and experiment with properties and materials in ways that we'd never thought of before. So we're talking here about educational innovation. That's what we're all working with, and that's why we're gathered here. And again, What's in the middle of this? The learner. The learner is, again, the bullseye, the thing that we're really aiming for. And to get there, to give that learner the best possible experience, what we're going to hear in the next day and a half is a wide range of personal experiences, reflections, pieces of research, studies, focusing around these three things that we see in this diagram. The educational mission, how do we realise that? The pedagogies that we use, challenge-driven education, sustainability as a focus. But all of it is about empowering people to be something that they weren't before. And this has been going on for a while. We used to focus a lot on content and on what we should transmit and on facts that you should know. But back in the 80s, we started to look at how people actually went about learning in a deeper way. And a lot of that work actually comes out of Sweden, work done in Gothenburg. And even in the 80s, that work had already reached out to where I was working as a young lecturer in a department, in a computer science department in Australia. So I didn't meet Martin and Celia myself, but I met Michael Prosser, who had worked with them on this work in deep and surface learning. And we moved on, we moved on from there. Deep and surface learning was one way of looking at how people approach their learning mission. But since then, this whole scholarship of teaching and learning activity has really gained focus for us. The whole mission of higher education has changed from being a process of educating the elite to being a way of preparing people to engage with our world in the future. We've started to look much more at what is that process of education. We've started to create fora for ourselves to exchange ideas with one another. Why is that? Because we suddenly realised that understanding how teaching and learning works best is an important part of our mission. It's one of the three pillars of Swedish higher education. What are those three pillars? Teaching, research, and service to society. And when we stand here today and tomorrow, we are serving one of those very important pillars, and we're helping to build it beyond what it has been into something that will be the future of education. So scholarship of teaching and learning can have many forms and many goals, and you'll see all of them in the next day or so. When I started out in this endeavour, my interest was in improving my own classroom teaching, making the experience of my students better in my subject area. So I was very much focused on the inner part of this, improving practice, my practice, what happened with my students in my classroom. As I worked more on this, and we're somewhere perhaps in the second of these circles with this conference now, within our environment, we're trying to improve practice, yes, but we're also trying to involve others. And we're trying to spread our ideas and gain experience from each other. And it's really important that we take the time like this to sit together, to feel that we're a community, and to exchange ideas and insights, because that's how we really, really grow in our practice. So we're understanding the learning that goes on here at KTH in our environments, with our students. And ultimately what we will do is contribute to that outer ring, insight into how learning is being supported. And that we can communicate beyond these walls, out into the world, and help to make the world a better place. So the most important thing, we're a community working together. Let's not forget that. And so the really important part of this next day or so is to get together, to feel that sense of community, and to exchange ideas with one another. So it gives me great pleasure to open the conference. Thank you. And so with that said, I have strict instructions that I am to remove my plug, and we will change devices. And it gives...
Thank you, Arnold. Okay, let me get my clicker. Make sure that's on. Yes. Yeah, I think it's working. So thank you, Arnold, for that introduction. And Thank you, KTH, for inviting me to speak about a topic that I think will be critical for the future of higher education, how to make higher education more, I suppose, relevant to today's challenges, more responsive to the changing world, more responsible in terms of ethics and values that we reproduce or instill, but also more reflexive in terms of rethinking some of the principles, values and systems upon which we have built our lifestyles, and maybe more reimaginative in terms of imagining viable alternative futures that are inspiring, that are positive and not frightening. Before I was going to, just before the start of this talk, I was actually going through my slides because I had too many, but I was talking to other people here about this event, and then I realized I should talk a bit about that too, and so I ended up adding slides, which is not good, so I have to go very fast now. But this is what I hope to do. Talk about sustainability not as an add-on, something we need to add to our already overcrowded list of topics in the university, but more as a catalyst for educational innovation. It's been mentioned, and also as a way to rethink the relationship between education, research, and outreach. Rather, we look at them as somewhat separate. How can we bring them together? I distinguish 5 what you could call learning areas for sustainability, 5 domains, dimensions maybe. I want to present those and introduce this idea of creating ecologies of learning, a more relational, hybrid way of coming to understand the world around us that is rooted in existential issues that really affect who we are and who we are becoming. And then I'll end with some closing remarks. Some of you know, I'm originally an environmental engineer at Wageningen University. Over time, I became more interested in sustainable development and finding ways to connect people with complicated and wicked issues in a meaningful way. But my concern has always been the planetary boundaries and learning to live more lightly on the Earth. And I realized after a while that even though technology can help us, it can also actually accelerate unsustainability if this is technology that is fueled just by innovation for innovation's sake and not fueled by a concern about, what we do with that technology and how it's affecting the Earth. So teaching, learning, capacity building became, I thought, like I say, these issues are not between the North and South Pole, they're between our ears. They're in the way we think, the way we value, the way we behave. So I gradually shifted towards education over time and also psychology, I suppose, to find better ways to connect people with these issues. Kate Raworth, economist from the UK, has an interesting model that most of you probably are familiar with. And I like it because she says basically the challenge is that we learn to live within the donut. We must have a solid foundation of good education, good health, social justice, gender equity, equality. And that foundation all people should have. And at the same time, we must learn to live within ecological or planetary boundaries. A lot of work on planetary boundaries has been done here in Stockholm. And so if you look at the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, you can say, well, they're kind of out there in that donut. Some are more on the inside, and some are kind of in the donut, linking both the foundation and the planetary boundaries. And some are maybe more on the outside. And the SDGs, I think, offer an opportunity for higher education to rethink the relationships between these topics. They can open up a window towards a more systemic way of looking at sustainable development. Of course, we must also recognize that in our society there's also all kinds of movements and counter-movements that try to cast doubt on what is happening to the Earth systems, and this cultivated doubt and this kind of post-truth and viral nonsense sometimes, which is also eroding trust in science and trust in governance, is something that we also need to be aware of in our universities. It can lead to skepticism, to cynicism. It can lead to anti-intellectualism, as we can see at the moment in the Netherlands, where one party that got a lot of votes last week is calling for asking the government to have a point, a kind of a reporting point where people can report when schools indoctrinate and universities students with leftish ideas. So you can have anonymous reporting of this when this is happening. And of course the government is very much against this idea, but it just shows you that there's also this erosion of trust and the casting of doubt around many of these issues. So critical literacy and also dealing with making distinctions between facts and myths is becoming more and more important, and having people or helping people understand how science works is also important, and also connecting science with the public good so that it's clear that science can benefit society and is more than serving journals with high impact factors. So this kind of working within that donut towards a more sustainable world is in a context that is not always helpful. The precautionary principle is an important one, and this is just a cartoonesque way of, what if we create a better world for nothing? It's often an argument that is presented that is kind of a false argument. And these kinds of phenomenon where it's no longer what you say, it's how you say it and how loud you say it. It's not about the science underneath that matters. It's just whoever gets to have the word out or gets to use the social media in a way that it actually influences people. And that can become very dangerous. One problem I think that we are all facing is that our education in some ways is becoming an extension of the globalizing economy. And why do I say this? I think efficiency and accountability have become so important, and our ability to measure performance so that we can maybe, as Einstein once says, we measure the things that count, maybe, or what you can't measure sometimes is more important than the things that you can measure, which leads to an emphasis on things that may be biased towards a particular way of knowing, a particular intelligence, like cognitive knowing, and at the expense of maybe socio-emotional knowing. But this trend of using education to help serve the economy, to have lifelong learning, to help develop young people's abilities to be flexible in the world of work, to always innovate yourself, to renew yourself, to grow personally. There's a bias towards change and development. We have a bias towards innovation and not towards conservation, as if it's only springtime, where there's growth and expansion, and we're ignoring the other seasons. And this is not just in world of work, where we also need to think about learning to live with less in some parts of the world, sustainable contraction, you might call it. And this is also true for young people not being able to reflect, to think about who they are, who they want to be, who they want to become. They have to work on their CVs. They are always distracted by the technologies. They always must run, they must move, otherwise you fall behind. And this is something that we must be aware of, certainly in engineering universities where innovation is like a buzzword. So when we talk about 21st century skills, here's a definition in a way that really shows how commodified education has become for economic purposes. It talks about that 21st century skills are the bedrock of our economy, and that we need that to be competitive, to remain competitive as a country, as a company. So these values of competition are very strong. The values of individual success are very strong. So in some ways, education is helping us become more effective vandals of the earth, as David Orr says. The people who have the biggest ecological footprints are not people growing up in that slide in India that we just saw, people who have not access to this lovely institution, but have to learn a lot to survive in that kind of climate through informal learning, other ways of learning. Their footprint is relatively small compared to the footprint of people with PhDs, master degrees, and bachelor degrees. So more education doesn't necessarily mean living more lightly on the earth. In fact, it might be the opposite, something we can discuss later. Here is a slide from just a week ago, I think, maybe 2 weeks ago, of Dutch teachers, also from universities and schools, high schools, primary schools, protesting in The Hague, because they're kind of getting fed up with a managerial approach to education, where they are held accountable for their performance, where students are input, throughput, output, where there's a lot of emphasis on excellence at the expense of laying foundations, and a lot of emphasis on testing and assessment, and not a lot of space to create more localized curricula or to have discovery learning or more inquiry-based learning. So people are, and they're also frustrated about not getting paid enough. Maybe for some that's the main motivation to be there, but for many, they're not happy about the climate and the culture that is at the moment strongly developing, unfolding in schools and universities. So there is some resistance in the system, and as I will show later, there's also resistance among young people, concerns about the environment, about climate. But many of these topics that we're talking about, they're in some ways you could say they're hopelessly ill-defined, or they're attractively vague. I like to think of them as attractively vague. You need to give them meaning in a context. These questions, they don't have clear answers. And the answer will change with time. The answer will change with where you are, where you ask the question, in what part of the world. And we can discuss all of these, and we will probably find it an interesting conversation. And in the end, we may not agree on what is the most sustainable answer. So often these questions are not simple questions and with simple answers, although some are simple. If we dump toxics in rivers, we know what the effect will be, and then we know that we agree on that's a bad thing, and that we should do something about that. But when we talk about things like climate change, it becomes a nexus issue that has to do with water, it has to do with energy, it has to do with distribution, it has to do with power, it has to do with institutions, it has to do with CO2 emissions, it has to do with the way the economy works. It's a very complicated issue with not one cause and not one solution. There is no precedent, it's ambiguous, it leads to controversies, there's disagreement about values underneath, it's not so easy to model or quantify. So these are different kinds of issues that we don't really have a good education approach for to immerse our students in these types of issues. So you could say that at the moment we live in an unusual time, characterized by high levels of complexity, of uncertainty, where science is also looking for a new role, not so much maximizing predictability, minimizing uncertainty, but learning to live with uncertainty, learning to live with complexity, and learning to live with emergence, which is a different kind of goal for science than, say, empirical, analytical, positivistic goals that we've been quite good in developing. A lot of confusion, the extinction of truth, lack of trust in science and governance, hyperconnectivity, it's been mentioned, the technology that connects us all leads to a lot of access to information, but as E.O. Wilson says, we are drowning in information while starving for wisdom. And that's the role of higher education, to develop wisdom in our society. Dominant neoliberal economic forces accelerate inequity and material values that normalize and kind of breathe unsustainability. Living unsustainable lifestyles is made easy. Living sustainable lifestyles is made hard. So this all calls for what I would call a reflexive society, one where we can continuously learn about what is happening, and when we change things, how it's affecting us, how it's affecting others, how it's affecting other species, now and in the future. Then we get into sustainability-oriented learning. So how do we move away from this normalized unsustainability towards a more sustainable society that is based on maybe different kinds of values than the ones that we have been emphasizing in our modern Western education so far? I already mentioned the youth movements at the moment, led in part by Greta Thunberg, here from Sweden, who is mobilizing lots of young people around the globe who are worried about their futures and feel that their education is not preparing them for the future that's coming. And this is an old slide that I've been using for a long time. I still like to use it. We are the students of today, attending the schools of yesterday, taught by the teachers of the past, using methods of the Middle Ages. So what then are new methods and approaches that can help young people and ourselves deal with these wicked sustainability challenges? We did, another part of my professional work is at Gothenburg University, where I've been a guest professor in education for sustainable development, and they have a unit that also wants to strengthen the capacities of teachers in the whole University of Gothenburg system through some basic courses that you have here at KTH2. And one discussion is, how do we pay more attention in the basic qualification for teachers to sustainability? And this was some of the discussions and some of the results of that. One was, it's not about adding, it's not about adding sustainability as a topic to all teacher preparations courses. There are other topics too that are also important. You don't want to have a kind of a competition between topics, that one says gender, that's important. Other says citizenship, that's important. Health, that's important. So to avoid that, it's better to conceptualize sustainability as a catalyst for innovation rather than as an end goal, which is maybe philosophical, but how can it be a trigger, a lever for changing the system? And if there is a topic there, the conclusion was it has to do with dealing with complexity, ambiguity, social scientific disputes, moral issues, perspective taking, switching, whereby sustainability issues are excellent vehicles to use. The third conclusion was, so the question is, to what extent is there a space for emerging pedagogical arrangements, didactical tools and heuristics that can help future teachers to be competent in these areas? And the last thing I already said, how can it be a catalyst that is inspiring renewal in light of these sustainability challenges? One model that I still find useful, that we developed a long time ago in 2002 with a Canadian friend of mine, colleague Bob Chickling, was to look at education on two axes. One you could call the participation axis, where authorities, experts, curriculum experts, scientists, they determine the content, they determine the agenda, what's needed, what's important. And on the other hand, it's more participatory, democratic, co-created. It's more open, you could say. The goals are more open on this side, and on the right side, I go too fast. On the right side, let me go back quickly. Yeah. On the right side, the lower side, it's open, self-determined. There's space for determining together what the direction should be, where you need to be going, what kind of learning goals we have for our students. And on the top side, it's closed, it's fixed, it's predetermined, it's kind of frozen. It's how many courses in our universities are done. You have the syllabus, you need to have a year and a half in advance, it needs to be approved, it needs to be all fixed. It's a legal document almost, which doesn't allow for a lot of flexibility and responsiveness. On the upper left, you might call instrumental education, and the lower right, more emancipatory education. And the upper left is very suitable for the more simple kinds of problems. Teaching photosynthesis, you could say, well, it's not so simple, but there is a clear understanding, scientific understanding, and you can teach that in a relatively straightforward way. And the way you teach that in Burundi is not all that different from teaching it here in Stockholm. The upper right, so photosynthesis, upper right gets more complex when you talk about, say, the use of pesticides, pest management. How can you do that in a responsible way? Then you already get into issues about economy, agribusiness, you get into issues of farming systems. It gets more complicated already. What is the best way? How do you teach that? Do you teach it experientially? Can you teach that in theory? Do you need to take students outside to do that? Maybe have some experiments with different types of pest management. And in the lower right, when we talk about, say, transitioning, creating urban agriculture or urban greening, where you need to involve many stakeholders, where creating a sustainable green neighborhood in Kampala, Uganda, is quite a different challenge from doing that here in Stockholm. It's highly contextual. So you can see that it's very important to find ways to assess what is the nature of the change challenge. Is it one of optimization or is it one of transitioning? Does it involve many stakeholders? Are there different perspectives, different values at stake? Or is there agreement and consensus about this? And you could look at different roles that people have in these quadrants. On the upper left, it's more the instructors, like I'm standing here now. You could say it's upper left. And in the lower right, it's more facilitators, co-learners, where you don't know exactly where your students are going. And you need to learn with them, but you can guide them. You can help them find the right connections, information. The role of the students shifts too, from passive receivers that reproduce what they are given during the exam. They give it back during the exam and they check if you gave it back the right way, and then you have the best mark if you give it all back the exact same way. Where you often forget after a few weeks because you've given it back. And then in the lower right, they're more active, empowered, because it's out of their concern that they participate. It's the issue that they care about. That's the point of departure, not a disciplinary problem. And the motivation is also shifting from extrinsic, I need a diploma, to intrinsic, I worry about climate change. I want more localized food. I worry about animal well-being. And the knowledge, photosynthesis, gravity, it's kind of universal on the upper left, but on the lower right, it's much more contextual, embedded in that community. Okay. 5 areas that I think are critical, and we've done some research at Wageningen University where we analyzed some good practices in sustainability teaching, and these were the 5 areas that surfaced. 1, dealing with values and ethics, thinking about the moral compass that is underneath what we do. If our university is going to work on smartphones for dogs, for instance, or pre-peeled bananas, for whom are we doing that? What is it adding? What kind of value is it adding? For whom? Is that a business thing that the company might use to increase profitability and shareholder value? And do we then as a university do that for them because it's innovation? Or do we start questioning? whether that is actually accelerating the use of natural resources in ways that we cannot really defend. So that's a discussion. What is it that our university or our research or our education is strengthening in society? What is it maybe silencing or weakening? Moral questions. Diversity and... I keep doing that. Dissonance is the second area that is critical. And I'll go faster because I want to talk about each of these. So these are the 5 areas, and if we go by them one by one quickly, one I already suggested, understanding the kind of change that we want or that is needed. Do we want to do the things that we do better, make them more efficient, optimize them, fine-tune them? Nothing wrong with the system itself. Or do we need to do better things? Which is rethinking the values and principles and rethinking the systems as a whole. And then you could look at it in this way. You can look at it from a technological perspective and from a more societal, socio-economic perspective. Incremental change is optimization, and transitional is changing fundamental ideas underneath. And if you do that for, say, food security, food and nutrition security, feeding the world in 2050, how do we do that? 9 billion people projected. Well, some say we need to optimize the systems that we have. Nothing wrong with agribusiness. We just need to reduce food waste. We throw away 1/3 of our food. We need to improve food literacy. And we need to be more efficient with resources. When we do that, we can feed the world. There are others who say, no, more will be needed. We need another revolution, not the green one, but the blue one. Oceans need to be used in a far more effective way. They hold the most nutrients, and they can, if we do it right, we can feed the world with oceans, using the oceans. Or genetically modified organisms, GMOs. If we do that, we can reduce pesticide use, we can reduce fertilizer use, we can make climate resilient crops. That's the way to go. That's a technological transition. Or there are those who say, no, we need to transition socio-culturally, economically. If we think about circular economy, or if we think about food sovereignty, food justice, 1 billion people underweight in the earth on this planet and 2 billion people overweight. There are issues of equity, distribution, or maybe we should eat insects, insect protein instead of meat. Well, that requires a transition of the mind for many. Not for all. There are groups in the world that eat insects. They have for a long time. And combining both the technological transition and the social, cultural transition, you may end up with something like, in some parts of the world, metropolitan agriculture, where it's about social cohesion, it's about clean air in cities, it's about climate-smart cities, it's about localized food systems, it's about rethinking mobility so that there are less cars in the city. It becomes a whole a nexus approach where you need both technological innovation and the rethinking of how we live together. And you could look at schools and universities too. You can optimize this kind of talk using technology. We can have flipped classrooms and MOOCs in the upper left. Lower right, alternative pedagogies, place-based learning, social learning, transformative learning. And some say we need all that, creating learning ecologies. I'll talk about that in a minute. I'll skip that. Values and ethics, to what extent do we open up conversations about moral dilemmas, moral issues? And there are different ways of doing that. Here's an example of the i360, the iAnimal tool. In the upper left, you see these Google Glass, the virtual reality glasses, where people can walk through an industrial pig farm with 24,000 pigs, and they can see how they live, and they can have a conversation about how that makes you feel, and how that affects you. And then you can also look at other farming systems and have discussions about that. It opens up questions about ethics, same about genetically modified food. How responsible is that? And people will disagree on that. But we tend to shy away from those conversations. Learning to make change, often sustainability-oriented education, is about awareness and understanding. But if we only focus on that, then it could lead to a feeling of feeling overwhelmed by these big problems that you cannot do anything about. It can lead to apathy, powerlessness. It can actually disinterest people. So to connect it with the possibility to make change, by empowering people to experiment with change in their own lives, in their own communities, using maybe citizen science, using guerrilla gardening, converting local spaces into something green, and to see the impact, measure the impact of that, can be empowering. And I think connecting it to the possibility to act is critical. Utilizing diversity goes without saying that we learn more from people who think differently than we do ourselves, than from people who think the same way that we do. We don't learn much in the bubble. And there are lots of bubbles nowadays. How can we cross boundaries between bubbles? How can we invite diversity? How can we become more creative? That also requires building strong social connections between people. If people are different and they don't have strong social connections, the diversity will work against learning. But if they do, if you can cultivate these connections, then it will help. This is an example from a colleague of mine in Malawi, Sotl in Chiota. In Lake Malombe, they did some workshops on local natural resource management, and they did participatory village mapping, and they did this with the male participants first, and then this was one of the results, one of their maps. Took them an hour to make this one. And they thought, well, that's not a very rich map. Why didn't we involve the women in this? So they got the women together, and within like 10 minutes they got this map, which showed a very different understanding of what resources in the community are than the one that the men drew. This is about gender diversity, but there are all kinds of forms of diversity that we have, even in our own classrooms, that we don't tap into. And the fifth area, systems thinking, boundary crossing, speaks for itself too, I think, on the left side. You know, we're very good at reducing the world into smaller units, in categories, boxes, disciplines. And in some ways, that's what led to what we have here. This engineering mindset has brought us lots of technological advances. But the kinds of side effects, the spin-off effects that are systemic and that lead to this global dysfunction require another way of thinking. And that is a more holistic, inclusive, integrated way of thinking. So how do we teach to think the world whole again? And it's not like children are born as reductionists. A child is born and sees the world as it unfolds holistically. But the more time this child spends in formal education, the more that child loses that ability to see connections and to establish relations. So we need to think about how can we prevent education from doing that? How can we relearn that? Because it's there. We have innate capacity for seeing connections and relationships and having empathy, but we lose it. So we need to think, what is our role as educators in restoring that, in regenerating that? Here's an example of the industrial cup of tea. You know, you have one tea bag in the middle there, and you can look and you do this life cycle analysis type stuff, input, output, throughput, energy-wise, material-wise. What's happening with that tea bag? It's connected to many things. If you look at the SDGs, here are some that you immediately might think about when you look at that whole process. And then you could ask still, is this complete? You could also look at this from a gender perspective. You could look at this from a smallholder farm perspective. Fair wages. Exploitation. So you could also challenge people to make links with all the SDGs and this bag of tea. And that's quite a challenge. With the SDGs, we tend to look for the ones that connect most to our work or our topic. But I think the challenge is to show how every SDG is connected to that topic. And sometimes it's hard to see that connection, but then that's the challenge. What does gender have to do with this bag of tea? It's there. Here's a more technical example, the smartphone. How smart is your smartphone? Very simple, you take an everyday object that young people, students, high school students, universities, we ourselves know very well. It's an integral part of who we are nowadays. But how smart is it? If you ask a class to bring old smartphones, old cell phones to school or to the university, you'll find 2 or 3 at home, somewhere in a drawer. If 20 or so bring it to the school, you have like 60 of them. Divide up the groups in 4 or 5 and let them each pick one of these smartphones and then ask some simple questions. I call it CSI, Critical Sustainability Investigations. What's it made of? You know, take it apart, do it with care, maybe safety glasses, maybe gloves. What's it made of? Where does it come from? How does that phone affect your life? How does it affect the lives of others? And how this positive change question, how can smartphones contribute to sustainability? That has to do with understanding. The 3rd and 4th question more with meaning, and the 5th with design and action. Now, from a physics point of view, you know, the phone might look like this, with resistors, condensators, print plates, things that have different functions in the phone. And you could talk about these functions as well, if that's really your interest. And some students will be interested in that. A chemistry teacher might look more at all the elements of the periodic system in the smartphone. There are about 50 of them. Geography teacher might be interested in where they come from, what part of the world. Biology teacher might ask the question, how does the mining affect biodiversity? How does the mining affect water quality? Economics teacher might ask the question, how does it affect the local community in terms of benefits? Where do the profits go? Does it go to local community? Or they might ask questions, what's the work environment like in the mines? What are the conditions? That's more maybe sociology, politicology. All the subject areas are in that phone. Or how do these minerals flow? If you would redraw the map of the world, what would it look like? Going very fast through this. What does it do with people locally who do not have access to the mine, but they also want to benefit from these very, sometimes expensive, precious metals? And you get this idea of blood cell phones. There's conflict around these metals. There's another angle. So that was understanding. Then how does it affect our lives and the lives of others? The meaning part, well, how is it affecting how we can concentrate? Our attention spans, how are they affected? Does it improve communication or does it become more superficial, more shallow? We can connect quickly, but can we also connect deeply? Do we still have a connection with the physical space around us when we're always looking at a screen? So these are questions. How does it affect your health? How is it that a phone becomes a part of your identity? That you feel ill or sick when you lose your phone? Well, how does it affect the economics in the world? A few companies have a lot of power when it comes to technology. People in Burundi, in Kampala, Uganda, and in Vietnam, in the most remote areas, they have access to smartphones and cell phones almost as quickly as we can get a phone here, you can get one in Burundi. Even in remote areas, you see phones everywhere, but no access to clean drinking water. Why is that? So how is it possible that some of these companies have access to that little bit of money in that community without even having to be there, to be there? So that's an interesting question. And we know some answers maybe. This is Nomophobia, a new disease recognized by the American Medical Society. It's how you feel when you, the fear of not having your phone. And this is what it does to you. Not sure how recent this study is or how it was done, but it's just to illustrate that it's such a critical part of our being. And it's good to reflect on that. The phone access in India, the lower caste, is about the same as in the richer, higher caste. But the portion of the income going to the phone for the poor person is like 1,000 times greater than for the rich person. So the access equality is equal, but the income equality is 1 to 1,000. So that's interesting to think about the implications of that. Because that phone is equally addictive for the woman on the right as it is for the woman on the left. And then you can look at the end of the cycle. If they are collected in a good way, where does the e-waste go? Who's involved in the e-waste? How does it affect the health of people working in that business? And so on. And then the last, the design part, you start looking at, are there ways to design a phone in a fair way, with fair metals, fair pricing, a way that you can take them apart and repair them? But also, can you come up with apps? Apps that can maybe help you eat more sustainable products, or can increase or make it easier for carpooling, or energy conservation, or biodiversity conservation. Can we use smartphones to monitor and measure air quality, sound levels, and make networks of data where citizens get more control over their everyday lives and their sustainability impact? Both their ecological footprint, but also their ecological handprint. The positive impact they can have. Footprint is negative, handprint is positive. There are all kinds of movements at the moment, and the question, I think, is also how can universities and students and staff participate in these movements and learn from them? And here are some niches, areas where you see a lot, it's quite dynamic. How can we participate in those kinds of movements? An ecology of learning might be one way of doing that. So an ecology of learning is a facilitated, partially designed, because it cannot be designed entirely, configuration of people, perspectives, processes, and learning spaces that organically seek to address an issue of mutual concern and to make an improvement, a change. And in order to do that, we need to be aware of the filters, the frames that we use to see the world, and understand that we have different views and perspectives on that. We need to think about how we communicate, how we are connected, the language we use, the media we use, and the technology that we use. We need to think of the whole range of mechanisms available for learning, peer-to-peer learning, master apprenticeship learning, online communities, informal learning, offline communities, games and simulation, citizen science. These are all kinds of forms of learning that are all relevant, and we need to bring them together. Different dimensions of learning, learning to know, learning to do, learning to be, the Delors pillars, Jacques Delors, but also learning to make change, learning to transform. We tend to stop with learning to know and learning to do. The rest, and learning to care is another one. Then there are different kinds of outcomes, from data that we collect and generate, information that is growing, understanding that increases, but also under meaning that we form and wisdom that we develop. Ultimately, those are the highest outcomes, you could say, of education, wisdom. And transitions has something to do with transitions in the way we think, the values that we live by. So these are the deeper things. Boundary crossing, developing agency and empowerment is all critical for that. So this altogether you could call an ecology of learning for transitions, where this is also blurry and there are permeable boundaries between these areas. And there's feedback loops. So it's quite a complicated model, which is a disadvantage. The more accurate you try to make a model, the less of a model it becomes. Urban Living Labs is one example of doing this. Amsterdam Metropolitan Solutions Center is organizing many of these urban labs in which the university participates, students, staff, but different stakeholders. They make an experimental, often temporary, depending on the issue and what is needed to resolve it, how much time is needed. Multiple stakeholders co-creating, testing, evaluating solutions of sustainability challenges in a real-world setting. So it is always in a public context, it's always different stakeholders involved. Usually they represent the world of education, the world of research, the world of governance, the private sector, local companies, businesses, and civil society, NGOs, sometimes activist groups, and they co-create sustainability. And what is then the role of teachers at a university in such a learning ecology? That's a big question, I think, also for this meeting. Another example from Wageningen University is all master students at Wageningen University. It's about similar size university as KTH, 12,000. It's an engineering university, life science engineering. All master students take this course, have to take this course. It's called the academic consultancy training, where there is outside and sometimes inside the university an organization, a group, a company that has a question, a concern. There's a desk, a university interface with society where these questions are gathered, and then they're connected with inter or multidisciplinary groups of students from different study programs who can apply for working on that topic. And then they develop an advice for this company or organization. They get assigned a content coach from the university, somebody who knows a lot about this topic. They get a process coach who knows something about group dynamics, working with diversity, and they get also some skill building activities. And in the end, they get assessed by the content coach, by the process coach, by the commissioning organization. How useful was it, what they came up with? How scientific was it? That's the content coach. How well did they work together? That's the process coach. And they give each other a grade for their own work. So they get 4 grades, that's average, that's their final mark. And there's some rubrics that help with that. And this really brings the university much closer to the local community. So there's 500 of these groups working on different topics every year. I won't get into the details. And we have lots of resources to support them. And these resources come from the Center for Development Innovation at the Wageningen Institute. And they have this multi-stakeholder process guide where all these principles and the kinds of activities that you can develop to learn about them and work with them are described. It's all open access, freely available. And here are some tools per stage. And some of them are very familiar. Belbin team roles, you know, I think. But there are many of these activities. Participatory mapping, I already showed you, is one of them. That can be used for that purpose. And there's also more interest in using the arts and arts-based approaches in engineering education. This one is also an EU project led by Wageningen University colleagues. It's called SUSPlace, Sustainable Place Shaping, with 5 different European countries participating. And this is also a toolkit that contains very, I think, innovative methods and tools for connecting students with place, strengthening their identity with place, but also empowering them to make change and to improve the places where they live. Okay, I'm wrapping it up. This is kind of the whole school approach, the whole institution approach that United Nations, UNESCO's Global Education Monitor Report in 2016 presented and described which is gaining more traction in education, also at primary and secondary school level. And it looks a little bit like this. It has to do with walking the talk, living sustainably, experimenting, participation, using the arts, greening the local environment, maintaining it as part of the educational process where research, education and outreach becomes one, basically. And that does pose a new challenge, I think, for our universities to participate in these kinds of learning ecologies. So, some closing suggestions. One, boundary crossing is very important. Look for spaces where learners can experientially investigate existential issues that are rooted in their life world and in their local environment, but while being mindful of the global context in which they are nested. Second, systems approach. I don't think that needs to be told here. That's not new. A lot of it is actually not new, but at the time it's more right than ever to start working on it. Diversity, utilizing diversity, looking for synergy, but also looking for conflict. Conflict and dissonance, disruption, transgression can all be triggers for learning, energizers for learning. There's a lot of emphasis. Not far from here you have the Stockholm Resilience Center. They talk a lot about adaptation and adaptive capacity building. But we also need to think about, recognize that there's a lot of systems like capitalism or the mafia, very resilient systems, very hard to change. They require disruptive capacity building. They require the possibility to start changing those structures and systems. So it's not just adaptive capacity building, it's also disruptive capacity building, transgression. And we don't do much of that in higher education, because in Holland we might be reported if we do that in the future. Although you could argue that this question about the normative side of education is not just about, you could ask the question, does our current education not have a bias towards a certain value that is a very economical one? Is not a hidden curriculum of unsustainability ingrained in our current system? So when people say, sustainability is very political, it's very biased, it's very values-driven, you could say, yes, in a way it is. It's about values of care, about concern, about the future, and we have to be honest about that. But our current system is also about values. But those values we should start questioning from a sustainability point of view. Okay, so what is it that we are strengthening? What are we ignoring and weakening? What needs sustaining and what needs disrupting? That last question, I think, is also important. And all of this does require, maybe we can discuss this a little bit in the group, that we rethink assessment, how we know what people learn and what they should be learning, how we can somehow make plausible that they are actually learning something without killing it by the assessment methods. And what does it mean for professional development in our universities for teaching? And that's, I think, a critical question for this conference. Thank you for your attention. And there is time for questions. I know it's a long story, lots of pictures, images, messages, but hopefully it wasn't overload and you will get something out of it anyway. So, thank you.
All right, so we've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. So we can use the microphones as well, so as to make sure that people are well heard. And of course, then we need technological assistance. Dun, dun, dun. Yep, it's all good. Right, do we have a question? Don't be shy. Okay, I'll start off with a question. I think particularly what you said at the end there was very interesting to me, because I think that we have increasingly moved with quality assurance of education towards a highly conformant and highly norm-guided model of what it is that we both assess and educating, and it's easy to take that and use it as a way of creating what we say, premiering declarative knowledge and fact, what we perceive to be fact, over some of these developmental processes that you've been talking about. How do you see that?
Well, I think part of there's a tension between the efficiency of bringing in bigger numbers and bigger sizes, class sizes, and where you lose that mentor-apprenticeship kind of relationship. Yep. Where you could get to learn and know whether students learn something through interaction with them when they talk about what they learned and reflect on that, and they share it and present it to each other, and you get 360 feedback. That type of setting is far more meaningful, but it's also more time consuming. And if you have 100 students, and for certain courses, you know, you could do online testing, I think, and it's very efficient and it probably will work. But if we're talking about learning around these kind of wicked issues where you need to immerse yourself in the context, then we need a very different form of assessment. Because now we are talking about the kinds of competencies that, in a way, and this sounds maybe a little bit odd, you cannot really possess. They're relational competencies. In other words, the situation you are in where you need to act brings out that competence. And the exam doesn't bring that out. The exam brings out other things, like what you maybe have remembered, the knowledge that you have, the understanding, which you also need to be able to share in a good way. But here we look for other types of learning. And capturing that, making plausible that somebody has learned something, requires space, interaction, more reflexive tools, but also that people they learn to write in a way where they can express this, and we've lost that ability. I think maybe we never had it, but we need to cultivate that ability to do that better.
Now, valuing performing competencies in a context is I think it's crucial also.
Yes,
I think we can have a think during the break, particularly, how do we think that's going to work in the future? Is there anybody else with a question before we move on? Anders.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. This academic consultancy training that you talked about, it sounded like a very ambitious initiative. Could you tell a little bit more about that?
Well, it's been around, I think, for about 8 years now, and it started with the usual, hiccups. But now it's become institutionalized, and it's become almost a trademark of the master's programs at Wageningen University, where, well, like I said, there is a mechanism for generating questions from society. Sometimes they're from the university itself. The university itself may want to do something about the carbon emissions through its flying. There's a project, the university had as a problem, okay, we fly too much, we want to reduce it, but also when we do fly, we want to make sure that the compensation that we pay for is actually having some kind of positive handprint. And students looked into this, and this idea of instead of putting the money into some kind of black hole, a fund that plants trees somewhere, which is usually what happens. You know how many kilos of CO2 you emit, and then it's translated into a money value. That money should go into a fund that is connected to the building in which the people that travel work, and that leads to an annual amount. And that amount of money goes into the building sustainability fund that is managed by the concierge, people cleaning the building, some of the staff, teaching staff, students. They make a kind of a board, and they together decide how this money will be invested in making the building more sustainable. So it becomes a more educative, participatory process that makes it far more meaningful than just, and so these ideas, so the question comes from the university. A group of students interested in that works on that for 6 weeks usually. They do some research. What have other universities done? Has this been done before? How can it be organized? They make a presentation to the university board. in this case. And then the university board will say, well, this is very helpful, or they might say this is not very helpful, not very useful for us, so they may assess it in not such a good way or in a very good way. And then people who know something about carbon footprinting from the university, they are the content coaches, they look for the scientific quality of the report. And then how did they work together? That's another person connected to every group that participates, has their own coaches. And then there's a whole financing system around this, because it's seen as part of your teaching. If you supervise a group or 10 groups like that, your department gets money for every group that I supervise. And the content coaches, or the process coaches, are usually people around the community who are good at facilitating processes, and they make a little bit of money doing that too. And they figured out a way so that this is balanced in their budget. So there is also a kind of an institutionalized system around this. Students value it generally very highly. And there's also examples of where it doesn't go so well, but generally it works quite well. And this is all about boundary crossing between science and society and different disciplines.
So the teams, they are multidisciplinary?
Yes.
They come from different master programs?
Yes, and they are self-formed teams. But there's also a mechanism for connecting students around the issue. And it's usually not one group that wants to work on it, but usually there's 3 or 4. So they have to make a pitch to the commissioner why they should be the ones working on that task. So there is an element of competition in that case. So 3 of the groups may pitch and not get it. They need to find another topic. And one group will get it. But that's also part of their learning. They learn lots of other skills in connection to this. How do you present? How do you pitch? Which is also important. Kind of entrepreneurship is also part of that.
Oh, very interesting. All right, so I hope you'll join me in thanking our keynote speaker once again. Thank you very much for a very interesting and stimulating talk. As you could hear from the